The first story is I have a friend, and he's a physician's assistant at a hospital, and suddenly he finds that he and his colleagues are dealing with this contagious new virus, and he's anxious because he's a frontline worker and he's definitely at risk, and maybe his family is at risk. And suddenly he and his fellow clinicians, they were being instructed by management to adopt a whole bunch of new patient protocols, and they seem to be coming at them, you know, fast and furious, and some of them aren't clear, and some of them don't even seem to make sense. And at the same time, they're learning that they're not going to have enough patient protection gear. And so this person, my friend, really cares about his work. He's a caring person, right? But nonetheless, he's starting to get worried. He's starting to get frustrated. And he wants to give the management the benefit of the doubt, right? You really feel like he feels like they're not doing such a good job communicating what's going on to the clinical staff. And when they do reach out to the clinical staff, it's almost as if they're not really interested in hearing what they have to say, what my friend has to say. And, you know, he and his colleagues have some really good ideas, right? They think they're on the ground doing the work, but it doesn't feel like they're being heard. And so over time, they're getting more frustrated. And then whenever there's a break and they're working with patients, they find each other, you know, meeting up for these brief conversations that start out sharing little sarcastic jokes or jabs. And then over time, they just turn into pure on gripe sessions, criticisms of the management. Like, you know, do these people even have a clue what's going on down here? Why don't they get out of their offices for a change and see what's happening? You know, another couple of weeks go by and there's even less dialogue between the clinical staff and the management, and the water cooler conversations are increasing. And the management starts receiving these emails that start out as, you know, forms of frustration, and later they're actually disgruntled sort of emails from staff, and the tensions begin to build there between the staff and the management. And after a long, hard day's work, my friend, in the hour right before bed, is on his computer, you know, looking around online for new jobs, right? That's story number one. Story number two, I have a friend, and my friend is now, finds himself working at home. And his wife is there a lot now. She's working more at home, and his kids are at home all the time. And initially, that's fine. It's actually fun a little bit initially. But over time, my friend starts getting kind of annoyed, and just annoyed by the behaviors of the kids. And the kids are on their screens all the time. And he, you know, blurts out like, "Hey, get off your butts and do something, right? Get outside, do something." But the kids are, you know, they're understandably getting very bored. And so the oldest kid goes to mom and says, "Mom, can I play with one of my friends in the neighborhood?" And mom says, "Well, let me talk to dad about that." She presents her case to dad. You know, here's her best social distancing argument. And dad says, "What about COVID? Don't you understand?" And his tension starts coming out. But eventually he gives in, right? And he gives in and says, "But it's going to be one kid, just one kid." And just a couple of days later, he's out working in the yard, and what does he see? Not one, but three kids, and they're all clustered together on their bikes. And he's like, now he's angry. And he blurts out, reprimands the kid. And then he makes sure to go back to his wife and sort of send her, "I told you so" message. Tension's building a little bit. They've been together longer and longer. And eventually, you know, he just comes out with a sarcastic jab to his wife, like, "Hey, nice sweats, hon. Gonna wear those till the end of the lockdown?" And she goes silent, and time goes on, and he throws out another one of those little offhanded comments, like, you know, "Don't worry, I'll just do all the dishes. You just lounge there." At this point, she finally reacts. "How dare you criticize me? Don't you think I'm here to serve you?" You know, all that stuff. "And how am I supposed to feel intimate toward you? Do you dress like that every day, right?" So that's story number two. And you might say, "Thanks, Paul, for the cheery stories to start my day." But maybe you, as I've been telling these, you found something familiar there. There's a story of your own that you can think of, right? Or two or 10. And of course, these are family or organizational dynamics or things that played out well before the novel coronavirus. I'm thinking of teams I worked with that for plenty of long periods of time worked well enough together. And then one day things weren't good anymore. Maybe someone felt disgruntled about something someone said or something someone did or didn't do, and things built up. And things just escalated from there. They unraveled. I'm thinking of large organizations that I've worked with over time, and for whatever reasons, they create these very distinct subcultures. And over time, these groups aren't agreeing on much anymore. And eventually communication breaks down and bigger and silos occur. So, it's there. You could say it sounds familiar because it is familiar, because in some sense, it is the prevailing story of conflict in our time. It is our culture's primary narrative around culture, around conflict. And the story goes something like this. For most people, at least, conflict is uncomfortable. For most people, conflict is scary. We've had so many bad experiences with conflict in our lifetime, or as a result of conflicts, that conflict is painful, it's bad. We find that people, including ourselves, can be at our very worst when we're in conflict. And as a result, conflict is something we should avoid at all costs. And of course, there are many among us, some on this call, that would actually say that, they understand the value of conflict, right? At least at some intellectual level, right? Working with differences and that kind of thing. But overall, conflict has negative connotations in our culture. But this is by and large our culture's collective conflict story. It's in essence our relationship with conflict. And, sadly, this story or this relationship doesn't offer us much agency, right? There isn't much we can work with here. So in some sense, we're in effect hostage to conflict, right? So here's just a little news flash. Just because we brush it under the rug or try to, conflict doesn't go away. It's in the words of Yusuf Islam, it's hard, but it's harder to ignore it. Right? And so the longer we go on without addressing rising conflicts, the farther we tend to move from each other. We become more polarized, right? More rigid we become and stuck in our positions. And as you become more stuck in our positions, we become less creative, less innovative, less effective. Our decisions become watered down or muddy. People don't own decisions, right? So in spite of this, right, this is just a story we live with. It's not such a great story. And I'm not suggesting that we're ever going to get rid of conflict, right? It's not just going to go away. I can't actually confirm this, but I'm pretty sure it's as old as humankind, right? There is no such life without conflict. And we can probably reasonably be safely sure that life is not going to get less complex. It's going to become more complex, and there's going to be more people. They're going to want more things. They're going to have more divergent views, and they'll want to be heard, and they'll want to be included. Right? So things are not going to get easier. There's not likely to be a time when there's the opportunity for conflict goes down. It's probably just going to go up. The opportunity will go there. And so given all this, it just seems kind of amazing to me that we are so ill-equipped to deal with conflict in our culture. We, in our families, we haven't learned the art of working well with conflict, I guess you could say. But I happen to believe, and I have a growing conviction that it is possible to turn tensions and conflicts into opportunities for growth and creative engagement. I've seen it. I've practiced it. And it's an area that just continually fascinates me. So I believe it's a time for a new relationship with this crazy conflict thing. It's time for us to adopt a new story. And so the new story of conflict goes something like this. So conflict isn't bad, right? It gets a bad rap, tensions and conflict, right? But it's how they occur that's the issue. It's not conflict isn't itself bad. It's how conflict is managed in our culture. Conflict really is the key to growth. Nothing changes. There's no possibility for us to grow without a little bit of tension and conflict. We need that. And in fact, conflict is nature's way of changing. Okay? So working well with differences and working well with conflict is going to help us be more creative. As I said, it's going to help us make better decisions, and successful resolution of conflict opens up all kinds of new opportunities for growth, personal growth, growth of our relationships, deepening of our relationships, learning more about ourselves. So while the old story kind of leaves us stuck, it leaves us victim, hostage, if you will, Once we have this new relationship with it, with this new frame, we have more agency. We have something we can work with. So I'm going to pause here and say that much, but not all of the content of this talk is drawn from the work of physicist and Jungian analyst Arnold Mindell, and also from the Lewis method of deep democracy. And that deep democracy is a facilitation methodology that's oriented toward differences and diversity. It was first developed in post-apartheid South Africa, and it has been spread around the world and used in a variety of different contexts. And I will send you some more resources on this after this talk. So now that we've established this new story, right, or this new mental framework, this new mental model around conflict, right, how do we actually work with it in a more healthy way, right? How do we turn those tensions and that emerging conflict into those opportunities for growth and creative engagement? So there are three ways I'm going to do this, three steps, if you will, I'll introduce. The first step is to embrace the following three premises. Like when I say embrace the following three premises, I kind of mean like own, embody, really deeply integrate this into your thinking, right? The first one is I understand that I don't have a monopoly on the truth. How could I possibly have a monopoly on the truth? We all are different. We all have our own histories, our own cultures, our values, our beliefs, our stories, things that matter to us. We see things differently. So I could never have a monopoly on the truth. We're different, and thank goodness, right? So embody that, embrace that. The second one is my goal is I want to stay in relationship, right? I don't have to love you necessarily, but yeah, I'm at work, or maybe I'm at home and I love you, it's with a friend. The idea is at least to stay in relationship. This is not about scoring points. This is not about winning, right? My goal is to stay in relationship. The third one is I understand that by addressing the conflict, by going into the conflict, by leaning into it, I have an opportunity to grow, to learn something new about myself that is going to be positive, it's going to be beneficial. Hope that makes sense. So I guess just heads up that the Deep Democracy Toolkit has a version of these three premises that is slightly different and is used as part of the heart of a conflict resolution process between two people. That can be very, very powerful. And in fact, my wife and I just used it 2 nights ago to great effect. Because we've been stuck at home a lot and kids are here and all that stuff. So I won't be able to get to that in this talk. Now, just to play around a little bit with these premises from a different perspective, like just imagine if you were to go into every situation where there was some tension, but you embrace the opposite of these three premises, right? If you said, I understand that I have 100% of the monopoly on the truth. I'm 100% right, right? Or I don't care about this relationship, right? What's more important to me is proving my point, winning. That's the important thing to me. Or I know that if I go into this conflict, if I address the tension that's between us or try to, everything's going to work out horribly. And I'm going to be worse shape than I was before, right? Obviously, this is a recipe for disaster, but it's a familiar one, isn't it? I mean, it's a familiar idea if you think about it. But what if we really fully embraced, as I said, these three premises, and we entered every situation with them in mind? What would it look like for you? You know, what would it mean for your relationships? What would it mean at your work? What would it mean for others in your world? What would it feel like, right? And at this point, I just want to mention that I want to be careful not to oversimplify things. For some people, many people that have experienced lots of trauma in their lives, even relatively small amounts of added trauma can be extremely difficult to deal with. So while these three premises and what I'll present to you going forward will still be useful, it may well be that more deep work or some kind of specialized support is needed for some. Trauma is very real. So the second step in turning conflict into growth and creative engagement is to understand the roots of conflict, to know something about human behavior and group behavior that'll help us be more skillful and artful of how we work with it. So you may be familiar with the metaphor of the iceberg for describing human conscious and unconscious mind. The idea here is that as humans, we have aspects of our experience that we are aware of, that we're conscious of, at the conscious level. I am aware that I'm sitting here with a screen in front of you and I got earbuds in and things like that. And my voice is feeling a little scratchy. There are people watching me. And there are also things I'm unconscious of. There's a ton of things I'm unconscious of. In fact, this metaphor suggests, this worldview suggests that the vast majority of my wisdom and my truest potential, my highest potential, exists below the waterline in my subconscious mind. And I can do all kinds of things to try to keep the waterline high so I don't have to feel the uncomfortable things that exist down there, because what's above the waterline in the conscious level tends to be more rational, more logical, and below the waterline is the more irrational, emotional. It's the hard stuff to look at. But that's where my wisdom and my potential lies. And this brings in, again, the work of Arnold Mindell, and he did some really pioneering work on the idea of groups and sort of translating this worldview to groups. The same metaphor applies. He calls it process-oriented psychology. Sorry, I'm messing with my notes. Process-oriented psychology. And it's pretty fascinating stuff. In the same way that we as individuals have things we're conscious of and things we're unconscious of, as groups, it's the same, right? So we have a consciousness as a group because we heard the same things. We were in the room. We exchanged stuff. And if I was listening and you were listening, we're collectively conscious of it. And, the same could be said for, we had the same data, the same materials, the same agenda. But really, for the purpose of this talk, I'm really kind of thinking about the dialogue piece of it, like we're talking together, and therefore we are collectively conscious of it. And again, by the same token, there are things as groups that we are collectively unconscious of, things that we are unaware of. So we have a group consciousness, and then we have these things that we're unaware of. There's actually a whole lot of stuff in any group that is happening below the waterline, right? And what's happening below the waterline, believe it or not, affects the consciousness of the group, but people are often unaware of it. And so this is important for two reasons, right? The first one is that, again, the real wisdom, the highest potential of this group, of these 2 people, of these 12 people, is somewhere maybe hiding in the unconscious of the group. Unless someone does something to lower the waterline and tap into that wisdom potential, it's there, right? But all too often, and for all kinds of reasons, we could talk about this for days, leaders, managers, parents, whoever, work very hard to keep the waterline high. And when this happens, all of us miss the health potential, the optimal functioning of the people, the group there. Author Jennifer Garney Berger, she talks about how easy it is for us to ignore data that might show us that we're wrong. She says we don't listen well to those around us. We get trapped in the world we've created rather than the one that exists. Another thing we do is we often look for alignment or harmony, right? Because we've had bad experiences with disagreement, and we can see how they lead to polarization and uncomfortable conflict. And what this does, though, it just narrows rather than expands our options, our solution sets, our possibilities for the future, right? The fact is that the more complex the situation we're dealing with, the more diversity of experience we need, right? More rather than less. In the book, the authors of the book, Crucial Conversation, talk about the idea that conversation is about the free flow of meaning. That's the whole point of it. Dialogue, in a sense, is the free flow of meaning. And they say the pool of shared meaning is a measure of a group's IQ. The larger the pool, the smarter the decision, right? So let's see, where am I here? Yes, where am I here? Pardon me for figuring out where I am here. Okay, now I know where I'm at. So when people are quiet during meetings, when they're not speaking out, when they're not sharing their views, their opinions, their perspectives, their good ideas, if they remain in their heads, those thoughts don't show up in the, show up in the shared pool of meaning. So that's one reason why this is important. The other reason that keeping the water line high is important is when we do that, people get disgruntled. We don't like to be told what to do, simply put. It's just like when we were children. Adults are just like children in the sense that children throw tantrums when they don't feel like they've been heard. And we do the same effectively. We want to be asked our opinion. We want our opinions to be heard. We want them to matter, right? And so when we feel like our opinions or perspectives aren't invited, when we don't feel like they matter, when we're not heard, when we're discounted, if we feel like it's not safe for us to offer our views or opinions, ideas, we feel marginalized. We get frustrated. We get angry. We get hurt. We get resentful. We might start to believe there are hidden agendas going on. And then, over time, we lose all trust. And we might not say anything. Right? We might just very well go along, maybe because it's not safe to do otherwise, right? There's a history of it at home, Maybe we're afraid it'll lead to another fight or loss of intimacy. Cat Stevens, Yusuf Islam again. From the moment I could talk, I was ordered to listen. Think about it. In a business setting, it could be career limiting to contradict or challenge or argue with the leader. And if you're feeling unsafe in a particular context, it's a pretty good chance that other people are feeling similarly unsafe, and this is not a good environment, right? So we don't say what matters to us. We just hold it in. It doesn't just magically go away, though. So here's a key point, right? It still matters to us. So it's still there in the unconscious of the individuals, and it's there in the unconscious of the group, okay? So what happens is over time, as these things don't get addressed, if the water line is kept high for different reasons, things will start to build up and eventually they'll start bubbling to the surface. And as soon as the person responsible for keeping the water line high, the boss, dad, whoever that is, the autocrat, leaves the room, you start seeing things happening. It might look like dissent. The person at that point, the autocrat, might very well act more autocratically. They might try to create more control, keep the water line higher. And at this point now, things start bubbling up more. And as they do, they become more disruptive and they become less productive. And the longer this goes unattended to, the things that bubble up start looking like open conflict. Right, makes sense? And so one way we can understand this is through a continuum of what we call behaviors that follow on something we call the resistance line. These are any kind of behaviors that start small, covert, unconscious to us when we're doing them often. They're small behaviors that go against the status quo in some sense. And then over time, as people feel more frustrated, more disgruntled, marginalized, oppressed, they become overt, they become larger. And the things I'm going to share for you are, there's a lot of nuance in between the things I'll label for you here, but in some way these are representative, they're archetypes of different types of behaviors. So one of the things as I'm talking about this you might do is start asking yourself, what are some of the ones I see in my workplace at home? What are the ones that I do? You know what I mean? What are my favorites? So the first one is the sarcastic joke, right? And jokes are great. We all tell jokes. They lighten the room, and at the same time, there are also certain types of jokes that have an edge to them or a barb to them. I don't know if you remember the little story I told up above about the dad, the husband, and the wife. And one of the reasons, we tell these is because we're uncomfortable sharing the actual true feeling, the thing that really matters to us. So it comes out as a sarcastic joke, right? And sometimes you hear them in a meeting or a business environment, and it's like, oh, there's a little discomfort in the room. It's like a physical discomfort, right? Political satire is an example. There's just lots of examples. It shows up a lot. It's someone sharing something, it's a way to speak indirectly about something. So there's probably some emotional roots to it, right? The next one is excuses. And this goes one step further down the resistance line. And kids not doing their homework and have all kinds of excuses for that is a great example. But it shows up at work a lot as well. Let's say you're the HR director and you ask your HR associate to finish this draft report on whatever the new leave policy is. And every time you meet with them, they have another excuse, right? And a lot of excuses are legitimate. But you start noticing over time, you might see patterns. And the theory here is when you see excuses or when you see almost anything, certain type of behavior showing up 3 times or more, there's probably something else emotional that's in the unconscious that's happening. There's something else going on. So the idea here with the waterline, there's a bigger fish below the waterline. These little excuses are just sort of little signals of it. There's something else not rational going on here. There's something underlying it, right, that has to be addressed. So the next one is gossip. And again, it may sound like it's a negative thing, but gossip is actually part of the human condition. And there are probably some really good things that gossip does by just creating shared meaning between people. However, it can be a way where people are sharing their true feelings about a situation. Maybe they're doing it at the coffee machine instead of in the meeting. And so you might miss it, right? The grapevine is an extension of the gossip, right? Becomes a problem when the grapevine or these back channels are actually more effective communication. There's more robust communication there than the formal lines. And that's not great because those views and perspectives aren't there when you might need them. And again, the managers at that hospital, they may or may not learn the good ideas of the clinical staff, and that could have huge ramifications. Next one is poor communication. We see it in so many different ways, especially at work. It starts by, maybe certain people aren't participating. There's a meeting going on and someone just says, I'm checking out my text with my friend or something like that. Or we could use leading questions that imply guilt or something like that. Or we might just stand in someone's doorway and interrupt them and tell them what's on our mind right then, because just blurt it out. It starts becoming more passive aggressive to moving toward more aggressive. This idea of communication breakdown is when, things escalate to the point where people just stop talking to each other. And we start doing parallel work, which is very expensive and problematic. They really break into silos. We start maybe emailing or texting instead of actually communicating directly, or we communicate through a proxy, or maybe at some point communication just stops altogether. And this little lower line at the bottom here I'll use my funny little pointer. Inefficient and ineffective. This basically is saying that, it's maybe not a huge deal when you're on the lower end of the spectrum here, the sarcastic jokes and excuses, but the longer this goes on, the more inefficient, the more ineffective you become, the more expensive thing it is to do things, right? It's almost like, when you see certain business environments and profit-oriented organizations that have such a weird, problematic culture. It's almost like they're making profit in spite of themselves. Never understood how they do it. So the next one is disruption, right? At this point, communication is really breaking down and the behaviors are moving from more covert to overt. And the idea is the simple desire just to be heard and to be considered reaches a point where people start kind of disrupting the process. They might block or sabotage, put things off, go at a snail's pace. The kid who's taken forever to clean their room is one example, but could be someone who's supposed to be writing a report, right? And they open the document maybe a couple times a week and they add a few sentences at a time and it never seems to get done. It's a way of blocking the process. or they might create bottlenecks. For instance, someone makes it so that all decisions need to go through a certain committee that only meets once a month and has a huge agenda. It's another way of doing that. Go slow. Yeah, I guess I was just describing go slow. Go slow is a term that I think originated in some context in South Africa. And the ultimate manifestation of go slow phenomena is actually the strike, where people just grind things to a halt until their demands or something like them are met, right, or agreed to. Student sit-ins are one example. Teenage rebelling with the parents saying, I'm simply going to do what I want, regardless of any consequences. And then when things get to the point where you feel like there's absolutely no other options, you have the choice to withdraw. People leave organizations and they have their exit interviews and they finally tell the person in HR everything they ever wanted to say but never said because they never felt safe before in the organization, or the divorce. But also this is the roots of, when people feel like they're absolutely oppressed and there's no options, war or outright terrorism, right? So another way to look at this is, well, as I said earlier, is what's in the unconscious. I say the wisdom of the group is kept there below the waterline, but it doesn't just magically go away because especially intelligent, educated people, they tend to be passionate about their ideas, but we all do. Here's a way to think about it. Like our majority democracy, the way it sort of works is usually around 51% win an election and 49% therefore must lose, right? And in our little democracy, I think the notion is that when you win, the losers are supposed to sort of just go along. They're supposed to be adult, just suck it up, right? But do they really go along? I mean, is that really, can that possibly happen? No, of course not. These people, the 49%, whatever that is, they care about what they care about. They're passionate about a lot of things and they don't forget that. And unfortunately, the 51% majority then moves on and says we have a mandate, and they don't do much to try to bring the other people along, quite frankly. And so what happens? Resistance behavior. And we see it everywhere all the time, every given day of our lives, unfortunately. So the resistance line is a really useful tool, and it can tell us, it's sort of a diagnostic tool. It tells us a lot about the level of dissent or disagreement in the group, or dissatisfaction due to people not being able to openly say what they need to say. And it also tells you a little bit about how likely things are to blow up, right? So how do you keep the waterline from, the resistance line from developing in the first place? How do you keep smaller tensions from turning into bigger conflicts? One way you do that is you learn how to work skillfully to lower the waterline. And sadly, given limitations on time, I'm only going to be able to sort of give a high level on this, but a little spoiler alert is that I will probably be offering 1 to 2 additional free talks where I'll go into this topic at a deeper level. And I'll also introduce the deep democracy approach to decision-making, which I quite like. And also talk about this idea of holding a conversation where tensions and conflict have arisen between 2 people. I'll do that in more of the detail. So lowering the waterline, one way to do it is to barge into the office, like your girlfriend's working at home in the office, and you just barge in there and confront her, and that'll certainly lower the waterline. At least it gets things out in the open, right? But maybe it's not the best way to do it. So of course we want to lower the waterline through dialogue, right? Through exchange. We want to have a healthy exchange of ideas, and we want to do it skillfully. Now the idea is to create the conditions for all the parties to say what needs to be said so that everybody feels heard and respected. And this is really about inclusion. This is about equity. This is, this is about diversity. We need to remember that it's not enough to simply respect our difference. That's not getting us where we need to be. We need to really invite the difference and the diversity. Because remember, we need, as things become more complex, as they are, as they will continue to do, we need more diversity of ideas, not less, right? And you don't necessarily have to agree with everybody. It's not like we all have to be best friends, but we should do our very best to ensure everybody's opinions, their ideas, their viewpoints are brought above the waterline and into that shared pool of meaning, and that each one is given equal weight. So here's a little ninja tip. A few things you should do before going into any conversation where there's something that matters between two or more people. Don't start into any conversation that matters unless you've internalized the three premises. Internalize those three premises I talked about. No one has a monopoly on the truth. I don't have a monopoly on the truth. I'm doing this because I want to stay in relationship. It's not about winning. And I realize there's an opportunity for me to grow and learn something about myself. The second one is pay attention to your tone of voice. Someone said something like 10% of communication is talking, something like that, and 90% is tone of voice. Maybe it's huge, maybe it's not, and then sit down. This is really interesting to me. I learned this with my daughter when she was around 15 years old, when we were having a lot of tensions, and I would find myself talking to her while standing up. And of course, I'm power, a male, I'm leaning in, I'm being more assertive, and it scared her. But this applies to almost anybody. Whenever there's a situation where you think there's a potential for there to be some defensiveness or some problems, sit down, take a breath, okay? So this goes to the whole issue of safety, I should say. I don't know if I have my slides in the right order here, but not everybody's going to feel the same way you feel, again, with respect to being safe, right? Some people have experienced lots of trauma. And Evan Gordon, who's a neuroscientist, talks about risk and reward being the fundamental organizing principle of the brain. So I'm going to be out of order with my slide here. He says that 5 times a second at the unconscious level, your brain is scanning the environment around you. And it's asking itself, am I safe? Is this a safe environment? Is this a dangerous environment? If you feel like it's going to be a triggering or a dangerous environment for whatever reason, especially if you're someone who's experienced trauma, your amygdala takes over. It hijacks you. You go into fight or flight. You're offline. And so if you're creating any conditions where someone might feel unsafe, they're not going to listen to you. They're just not going to listen to you. So the idea here is be smart, right? Be smart. So there are a few important goals that when we're trying to lower the waterline, we want to focus on. Okay, so going back to this slide, the first goal, and this kind of comes out of the deep democracy tool set, is to gain all the views. And to do that, we have to be genuinely, unambiguously open to it. We have to invite those alternative views, any view. Maybe the meeting goes something like this. Good morning, you do your little check-in. What are your views, ideas, your opinions, your questions? Let's hear all the views. Hey, my feeling is this. I think we maybe, there's what I think we should be doing, but this is too important a decision. I need other perspectives. What are your views, right? So you're creating the conditions by genuinely, authentically, congruently saying, I need to hear more views. Like, I'm not smart enough to make this decision on my own, for goodness sakes. Or you could simply start the meeting by, hey, what's left over from the last meeting? What's important here today? Let's build the agenda that way, right? You're at home, like with your wife, and excuse me, going back here, and you realize, or your housemate maybe, that there's some tensions. Things have been building up and it's not feeling good. And so you say to the other person, hey, I noticed that there's a little tension between us, and being home this much together, must be as hard on you as it's kind of being on me. I'd really like to hear what's on your mind, because I value this relationship, however that works. So the second goal in this process is making it safe to say the no. And in this view, in deep democracy anyway, the no is any alternative view. It could be a very small no, like it's a little different than what you're saying or what you're thinking, or it could be a big no. It doesn't matter. Well, first of all, you need that to make good decisions. You need that diversity, but you want to let people know through your actions by inviting it and sort of making it safe. Like, we need different viewpoints. I need to hear those. Like, I think we may have missed something. Does anybody have something different to say? You know, these are some prompts you can use to do that. It's critical, though, that when you're talking to people at home or back in your business setting, you share your view, you invite people to share their view, and people are quiet. You assume, oh, they must not have a view. They must not have an opinion. And I say, come on. I mean, yeah, it happens. You know, maybe they're at the wrong meeting or something like that. For the most part, people have a view or an opinion, but maybe there's all kinds of reasons why they don't currently feel safe to share that. Or there's this idea where people are nodding their heads. So you take that as tacit approval. So we don't want to do that. George Bernard Shaw says that, what does he say? The single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And again, that raises the whole issue of safety again. We're trying to lower the waterline. We're trying to make it safe to say the no, the alternative view. But it doesn't mean people are going to be ready to go there. So it could mean that we need to be patient. We need to build trust over time. One way we do this is to continually, genuinely, authentically invite it and make it safe to say the no. A third way that we can, and another way we can make it safe to say the no, is what we call spreading the no. So for many people, it can be very risky to share an alternative view, something that doesn't go along with the harmony of the group or with the leader or with dad. It could, you know, it could be, like I say, it could be career limiting. They have all kinds of reasons and experiences to tell them that, yeah, that hasn't worked for me. So one of the ways we can do that is you hear someone sharing, maybe initially just tentatively, an alternative view. You don't go, hey, Anne, thank you for that alternative view. You don't even have to name the person. You say something like, hey, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that. Does anybody else feel a little bit this way? Does anybody else feel a little bit this way? Does anybody else feel a little differently? Can anybody else relate to this? So what you're doing is you're taking it off Anne, because Anne doesn't want to feel scapegoated or pigeonholed. Because what often happens, the meeting happens, someone finally says the thing everybody's been thinking, and outside in the hallway after the meeting, someone comes up to the person and says, thank you for saying that, you know, because nobody wants to say it. So you're trying to make it safer in this way for people to say the no, or to say what matters, right? And over time, I'm glossing over this, I understand that, but you can begin to embrace this as a sort of like a business etiquette, just as the way we do business here. And a home etiquette, you know, a way we talk around our house. Doesn't mean that you, the decision maker, the dad, don't get to make the ultimate decision, but you're inviting people's views, you're genuinely listening to them, you're making it safe for them to have them, right? So I want to close by saying that nobody really wants to live this old story of conflict. Nobody wants to have that relationship that we've been having with it, because it's not good. It's not productive. It's not healthy. It's not joyful. And not that I'm like, we're ever going to love conflict, but we can learn to dance with it. We can be more artful with it. And so the idea is it's not inherently bad, right? The differences between us matter because they matter to us, right? So these differences are important. And while going into conflict is scary, maybe it's really risky, if we begin to embrace those three premises, if we understand the roots of conflict, we can begin to, and you know, what I'm saying there is the roots of conflict is if we understand human psychology, we can have more empathy for ourselves and others. We're less likely to have these smaller tensions turn into big conflicts in the first place. So we want to learn to recognize the signs of resistance. We want to learn to be more skillful at lowering the waterline and allowing people to be heard, right? That way we can stay together, grow personally, professionally, and be more creative. That's all. So I'm going to pass it over to you again, Kate, and let's see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Paul. We do have a few questions. First question is regarding the resistance line and some clarification around, the question is, so more overt does not necessarily mean ineffective, correct?
I think the general idea is the more overt they're becoming conscious, and we're doing things with intention to in some way sabotage or go against the status quo, right? And so they are more ineffective. They are more expensive. They reduce the health and productivity of the group. I think that's the general idea. In South Africa, this was originally called the terrorist line. It's just not a word that's landed well in North America. But just to be clear, the idea of terrorist line suggests that terrorism doesn't come out of nowhere. Like people just like decide to do terrorism. It comes out of some built up frustration that finally finds an outward expression. Very negative, of course. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. And interestingly enough, the next question actually references South Africa. Examples of instances of real or perceived power differential where the party most interested in conflict resolution doesn't have agency to successfully request a conversation. It seems that apartheid South Africa, oh, sorry, I just lost my question here. Apartheid South Africa only forced the conversation because of international disinvestment. It had to get pretty elevated for those with less power to successfully lower the waterline to the point of a conversation.
Yeah, that's a very big topic and an interesting question. I think there's a question there. And I guess one thing here's a reference, and maybe I'll try to share this in the email. There's a book by Adam Kahane that's called Collaborating with the Enemy, How to Work with People We may not like or agree with, but he has some really interesting points in there around when we sort of run out of choices. Like we have an opportunity to, we can force, we can withdraw, we can do these different things. Deep democracy, just very briefly, was not in any way did not impact the movement toward the apartheid movement and the changes that happened there. But it was something that was born out of work that happened in one of the largest public employers in South Africa post-apartheid, where there were just so many lifetimes of racist experiences and relationships and so much polarization. And they were trying to teach people to deal with these really deep emotional issues in real time on their own. So that's kind of how it was born. So I hope that helps a little.
Thank you. The next question. This has been great for ways I can approach conversations in a safer and open way. Do you have any suggestions for how we might get others, especially those in positions of power, to adapt these ideas? For example, leadership likes the status quo and doing things the way we've always done it. How do you bring ideas to the table in a way that could encourage real discussion rather than defensive responses or knee-jerk reactions?
Again, these are big questions, but yes, thank you for asking it. And when I do these trainings, right, 2-day deep democracy, they're called co-resolve trainings. And when we get into conversation and dialogue, this is probably 50% of the topics we get into is how do we have others above us in particular sort of embrace these ideas. It really depends on power and relationships. And every situation is different and people are very sensitive to power. And so you have to sort of suss that out. One of my favorite responses whenever someone's trying something new inside of an organization, they don't have full authority, is to try it. Do it. Skunk works it. Do it in your own group. Prove the worthiness of that, of your efforts, and show people how it can be done. And then over time, when you show how, like, the positive results of it, then you try to get permission to grow that. Like you've been piloting it, you try to get permission to grow it. Another way that we talk about is, there are different roles in any business setting. Like in a meeting, we're in meetings a lot, and you have a leader, the so-called leader, titular leader. You have a facilitator, and then you have participants. Depending on who you are in that context, you have different possibilities. And even as just someone who's a participant, assuming that is not some kind of weird, toxic, autocratic environment, you can begin to just practice with these same steps that I described. Like you can share your alternative view. When you hear someone else take a risk and share an alternative view, you can make sure you go, oh, that's interesting. I'm curious, does anybody else feel a little bit that way? Does anybody feel different? So you can sort of practice it. And maybe that boss or that leader over time starts seeing the value in in this different way of being.
We've had a few questions around sort of the logistics of the recordings. So I'm just going to kind of lump them all into one question. And that is, once folks get the email with the link to the recording, can they then share that with others? And will the PowerPoint be included along with the emailed video link? And can you send a reading list along with the email with the link?
Yes. Yes times 3. Yes to all those things.
Excellent. We've got another question that's popped up here. How would you deal with settings, and there are many, when there is an unquestioned patriarchal structure or reductionist Western or very visible power differentials, but that are never questioned, or all three together?
Can you please repeat the question?
Yes. How would you deal with settings, and there are many, where there is an unquestioned patriarchal structure or reductionist Western or very visible power differentials that are never questioned?
Gosh, such good questions. Because we're really, I mean, I don't mean to deflect the question, because we're getting into big questions about power, power is, you know, people are super smart. They walk into a room and they know immediately where the power lies, and what's, you know, that's that idea of like checking your brain is so like looking around, trying to decide if it's safe, trying to decide if it's safe. And sometimes if you're a participant in that system, it's very hard to do that. It can be easier for an external person, a consultant or a facilitator, to do that. I find it very enjoyable to throw out provocative questions. One of my favorites, and I've done this in more than one occasion. I remember being halfway through a one-day retreat with a group of people, and I could tell there was something brewing, and it felt like there was a question that wasn't being asked. And I threw out the question, what conversation, if we could have right now, would make the most difference? And people broke into groups of 3, and they talked a little bit, and then they reported out. And nearly unanimously, it was the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They've been not talking about it. So at least it was out in the open right now. So it's above the waterline, and we can work with it. But yeah, that's such a big and important question, and I'd love to keep that dialogue open with whoever asked that question. I'd love to have your thoughts on it as well.
So time.
And I would say just one last thing, Deep Democracy, if you're doing one of their longer trainings, like the 2-day co-resolve, there is a whole section on rank, which speaks to that at some level.
Thank you. So time check, we are just 1 minute shy of 10. We do have one last question. I don't know if you want to try to answer it quickly, Paul.
Let's see what the question is.
It is asking, if you are familiar with Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, can you speak briefly about your sense of it in comparison to this method?
I am familiar with it. I studied it when I was in my grad program. Excuse me. I would also, if someone interested, and I'll send this out as a reference to the book Crucial Conversations, has some really good stuff in there. There's a lot of alignment. So I would say there's a lot of alignment. I am personally, I find this more practical, without getting into the details, than some of Rosenberg's stuff. One of the things I really like about what Rosenberg does is he draws on the work of a Chilean-born economist, Manfred Max Neef, who's a big hero of mine. And he talks about the idea of there being 9 fundamental human needs. And they're seen as a system, not a hierarchy. And if there's one need or more are not met, if others are met at some large degree and others are not met, poverties occur that lead to all kinds of problems in society. So I think that's a really lovely part of how he integrates that in there. But thanks for the question.
Well, we just reached the 10 o'clock hour. I want to thank you all for the wonderful questions and for joining us this morning. We will be sending a follow-up email to everybody who registered with the link to the recording, the PowerPoint, and as well as a reading list recommendation from Paul. Thank you again and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you all.